My name is James Isaacs, and I am an arborist and manager at a little company called Tree King up in Auckland. I've had an interesting career in the arboriculture industry, spanning about 15 years and counting. Got my start, like a lot of us did, needed a job. Arboriculture was desperate for workers, so I found one, dragging branches. I then became a sort of fairly mediocre climber. And then very early on, I ended up in small business. So I actually founded Tree King back in 2010. As a business, went all right. It made okay money. It grew sort of fairly quickly. But I always had one huge problem. And that was that it was very difficult to find arborists. And once you found them, it was very difficult to keep them. And I felt like I was always kind of bending over backwards to keep people happy. I'm not much of a people person to begin with, so it didn't really jive with my personality. So after about 6 years of battling away with that, I thought, nah, this isn't me. I sold out of the business. I sold all the trucks, got rid of all the staff, and replaced them with machinery I could run completely on my own. So I kept a digger, I kept a couple of stump grinders, and I bought a great big forestry mulcher. It's a big skid steer with a big tree smashing machine on the front of it. I went back to doing everything myself, all the admin, all the work, all the quotes, everything. Now, to some people, this might look like the perfect business. I mean, it had virtually no overheads, everything paid off, all the stuff was fairly new, no staff, no worries. But as a business, it had one major problem, and that is it was the most boring thing I've ever done in my entire life. Now, anyone who's ever driven a forestry mulcher will know exactly what I mean. So these things are basically a giant lawnmower, except the lawn goes on forever and ever, hectare after hectare. And you're not mowing nice plush grass, you're typically mowing horrible spiky gorse, which of course pricks you when you get out. Aside from that, it also hides the terrain, which makes you quite prone to driving into a ditch or a hidden pond and getting the thing stuck. And then, of course, you're 100 miles from anywhere, completely by yourself. You've got to get someone out there with a tractor to pull you out, which eats up the profit of the whole job. Not a business model I would recommend, but it does give you a lot of time for thinking. So upon driving this thing along, pondering to myself, I realised that although staff, they certainly are the biggest pain. I'm not arguing with that. But they're also what makes it worth doing. They're what turns it from just some guy driving along in some thing he bought to a real organisation with real structures and management, like a proper business. So I decided I needed to learn a little bit more about how this is meant to be done. So I went back to university, I got into a Master of Business Studies, and I opted for the majority of that to be a 2-year research project looking at the skills shortage that had given me so much grief. This is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, fun fact, while I was doing this research, I needed a job, and frankly, driving a stupid forestry mulcher wasn't it. So I went back to Tree King, and I got a job as a climber under the new owner, Luke. 4 days a week, but I tell you, this is the best time I've ever had in this industry. And in fact, I still work there now. So I will say I far prefer working at one of these businesses than owning one. Which makes you think. Anyway, skill shortage, an insufficient supply of appropriately qualified workers available and willing to work under existing market conditions. Now, this definition is important because it has two parts. The first part is obvious, the supply part. Everyone understands that. It's like, oh, skill shortage, supply, supply, supply. What can we do to rectify supply? But if you don't simultaneously address the market conditions part, anything you do with supply is not going to work. If you just bring more people into the industry and they immediately leave once they've reached the level that you need, you're not helping anyone. So I've got some experience with this in New Zealand. Early 1990s, we managed to get arborist as an occupation added to the Immigration New Zealand skill shortage list. You can't say this wouldn't have dramatically increased supply. Now, instead of training our own arborists, we're able to literally comb the entire globe. So it would have increased supply substantially. But as far as the skill shortage goes, it made no difference. And the skill shortage is still with us today, as strong as ever, 30 years on. And the academic literature has something to say about that, and that is if your skill shortage persists over time, which 30 years certainly qualifies for, you should have a long and hard look about how you're setting your wages. Now, I did examine this briefly, albeit toward the end of the study, and what I found was that wages are largely just based off other wages. So the small firms will kind of base them off what the bigger firms are doing. The bigger firms might do something a bit more elaborate using consultants and kind of comparing them to similar workers in comparable industries and that kind of thing. But basically, it's a concept called relative equity. Now, the idea of relative equity is that it's not the overall level of wages that workers are concerned about. Rather, it's how their own wage compares to other workers that they know, which might have some value in a factory or something, but as far as solving a skill shortage, it's not helpful. See, wages should be based on demand, with the goal to find the market-clearing wage. So that is the wage that induces a similar number of people as you need to do the work. If you achieve this, it's called labour market equilibrium. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the circle on the left represents the supply of arborists. So I've got a hypothetical wage of $40 per hour. Don't get caught up on that figure. It's just an example. Literally, you can insert any figure you want in there. So supply, bigger circle, more arborists, smaller circle, less arborists. We've got the circle on the right there. That's the work that can support at least a $40 per hour wage. You'll notice the circles are the same size, representing equilibrium. Now, this is the perfect, most efficient way for your industry to be as far as labour optimisation goes. And we are a labour-based industry, so this is the best way for the industry to be. You're not training a single arborist that's not going to be able to find work. You also don't have a single bit of work that's not being done because you don't have enough arborists. And you should basically be increasing your wage until you get to this point. So you get a few naysayers and things in the media that don't really understand what they're talking about, and they say, oh, we can't increase wages because it will increase inflation. That's true of what we call a deleterious wage increase, which is one that's not based on rectifying a supply condition. One that is based on that is called an efficiency-enhancing wage increase. So anything in pursuit of this is going to increase efficiency. So we'll do a little thought experiment. Imagine we got to this, it's all perfect, everyone's happy, we're getting the maximum amount we can for all our arboricultural work. Why would we ever deviate from that? Well, you wouldn't choose to, but you could possibly be forced to, because the labour market is heavily influenced by the product market. So the product market is where you sell your end product. For arborists, that's arboricultural services. So the cost or the price you're able to get for those services, if it's too low, say because there's a lot of competition, that will put a very real restriction on what you're able to afford to pay for wages. And that will push it below this equilibrium point. So let's imagine maybe a big multinational or something entered our product market, drives prices down, drives wages down as well. What would that look like? drive them down 25% from $40 to $30. And we get an immediate reduction in supply. I think that's fairly obvious, based on the premise that at least some arborists would have done the job for 40, but will no longer do it for 30. I think that's a safe assumption. So now we've got a problem. Now we've got a skill shortage. This greyed out section represents deadweight loss. So this is work that's not getting done at all. It's work that the customer's not getting the benefit of having it done. The workers aren't getting the wages for doing it. And importantly, the firms that make up the industry aren't making the margin on that work. And deadweight loss even goes a little bit further than the reduction in supply. We'll look at that in a moment. But something very important to note about this is that this loss, this inefficiency brought about by deadweight loss and other inefficiencies that are introduced, such as high search costs, that's your recruitment costs, and like inefficiencies by having to use maybe workers that aren't exactly what you wanted. The cost of all this exceeds the saving in the wages. So it decreases efficiency being below equilibrium like this. But why did that little green dot get so small? Because now, this is not work that can support a $40 per hour wage. Now it's anything that can support a $30 per hour wage. So we get this new golden ring around the outside. Kind of looks like a bullseye, doesn't it? Probably more of a bull's up, but we'll get to that. So in the middle, our tiny circle of high-value tasks. These are the ones that we could have achieved equilibrium with. Then we've got in grey, we've got the deadweight loss, and then we've got a new ring of lower value tasks around the outside. A bit more detail. So the high value task characteristics, these are often essential work. Remember COVID, remember we all had to be super careful, but we still had to go out and do the trees. Still had to do the power lines, we still had to do the emergency work. So this is work that it has to be done, no matter what. It probably requires arborists, so it has a technical basis. So you can't just use anyone to do this work. It's these two things that give it its high value. And when you look at them together, so the work has to be done. It's not an option to not do it. And it has to use arborists. You can't go and use someone else for it. We've put these two things together. You could really charge whatever you wanted for this, couldn't you? So it's a terrible shame if you then turn around and charge an amount that's insufficient to allow you to pay enough wages to ensure you have enough people to do the work. Other characteristics, large proportion of this is heavily protected by barriers to entry. Some great examples are the municipal sector, local government contracts, things like that. Not just anyone can set up and do these. And that's probably a good thing. It does protect the value to some extent. We still have significant competition even in these sort of protected areas, which drives down the price, but it's better than nothing. I'm certainly not advocating for removing any of these barriers. Final point, these tasks lend themselves to professionalisation. So this is important. If you've been asleep up until now, you want to learn about that. So not to be confused with professionalism, doing something in a professional way. Professionalisation has to do with turning an occupation, such as the arborist occupation, from a mere occupation into a profession, like the medical profession, like the legal profession. The crown jewels of which is claiming exclusive jurisdiction over the tasks that your profession will be performing. So this is your occupational licensing, that licensing that everyone bangs on about. This is how you do it. If you want to learn more about it, there's a great, albeit old article by Walensky, 1964. It's basically a how-to manual in professionalising your industry, and loads of industries have done it. There's great examples in like the electrical, a lot of parts of construction have done it. And the first stage of this is making sure you are doing the right tasks. And these tasks, the right tasks, are those with a technical basis. So you can sort of see here that it wouldn't really be a hard sell if we were doing the right kind of tasks to lobby the government for a license for this. I mean, it'd be like, look, we've got this work. It has to be done. So it has to be done. And it already has to use arborists. There's no other possible way of doing it. Do you think as maybe just as a precaution we could add a license to it just so non-arborists don't accidentally go along and do it? I mean, that's not a hard sell. Unlike our new tasks we've introduced. So these do not lend themselves to professionalisation. They're typically hard labour. So some examples given to me were hedge trimming, branch dragging, and log carrying, among others. And you can sort of see what I mean. I mean, can you imagine some poor guy trying to unload his car and carry his firewood into his house? And you go, oi, put that down. It's the exclusive jurisdiction of the arboriculture industry. Get a licensed arborist to carry that log for you. Obviously ridiculous. Yet this work gets done at the expense of the high-value tasks that are not. Because unlike the better stuff, there's no barrier to entry for this. And this is not necessarily just made up of the log carrying and the branch dragging. Obviously, you've got to cut those off trees and things. But all of the work in here is dragged down to this low price. Another thing on the hard labour, the number one thing that arborists dislike about their jobs is the fact that it wears out their bodies. So adding a whole lot of stuff like this is probably not a good idea. Second thing that they hate about their jobs is that the wages are crap. Final point on these, new businesses tend to start here. So when I did my interviews, people had all sorts of things to say, and then at the end I'd question them. So what is causing this skill shortage? So I had a lot of good things to say about arboriculture. So why aren't people doing it? And several of them said, oh, well, it's these cowboy firms. They're coming in and they're undercutting us some price, doing a $2,000 job for $500, skipping health and safety and all of that kind of thing. And they're giving the industry a bad name, making it difficult for us to pay enough for our workers. And to an extent, they've hit the nail on the head, haven't they? Except for one thing. I would question whether it is, in fact, them pushing themselves into our industry, or if it's us that's pushing our arboriculture into their low-value markets. So it's something to consider. Anyway, moving on. So reality is a little bit more complex. We've only looked at one wage, one market clearing wage, when in reality there's all sorts of different levels of arborist, all sorts of different positions. Although we don't really formally recognise them in New Zealand, you're kind of a qualified arborist or you're not. Like, there's no real structure to it. But if you did break it up, each of these would have its own market clearing wage. So there'd be a certain amount you'd need to pay someone straight out of school to make sure you had enough of them, and there'd be a different amount that you'd need to pay to get that 10-year veteran who's going to be supervising and training and whatnot. And another thing that complicates it even more is that if you arrange these in a sequence, they actually affect the market clearing wages of the ones below them. For example, if you make the top one higher, then that suddenly means the lower ones lead into something a bit more worthwhile, and then you don't have to pay as much for the lower ones. So a great example of that would be, say, like an advertising internship. Don't get paid anything at all to do that. Why would anyone do it? Well, you do it because it leads to a lucrative career as an advertising executive. whereas the market clearing wage for the internship is effectively zero. So you do it because it leads to something. So if you can fix that top position, then it means all the lower ones lead to something a bit better. If the outcome of your career is that it leads to a whole lot of non-transferable skills, an inability to do the work, and lifelong joint damage, chances are you're going to need a very high number to clear the market for those positions leading into that. So anyway, all is not lost. We could take these little gears and just arrange them in a bit of a thing like that. Now we've got a career ladder within the occupation, and we can identify what each of these levels are, and that would allow us to set our wages with a bit more accuracy. So if you went to a consultant or something and said, oh, I want to work out the market clearing wage for my arborists, they'll say, well, what exactly do you mean there? Like, what are you trying to get enough of? And you say, oh, arborists. And I say, oh, can you be more specific? So this is the more specific. In summary, wages should be based on demand with a goal of a market clearing wage. The very fact that there is a shortage and it hasn't gone away, is proof that the wages are too low. Cost affects the end usage. If you make something cheap, people will use it for anything, and that includes your arborists. You make them cheap, you find a whole lot of low-value uses for them. This turns it from something professional into something that's just a whole lot of people just doing a whole lot of cheap rubbish. And final point, paying below the market clearing wage costs the industry more than it saves it. So any increase in the wage that attracts more people and allows us to do all of the work will put more money in everyone's pocket, and that includes the businesses. All right, set of references up there. If you want any of these off me, come and see me after. And more than happy to work with anyone if they're trying to, solve any of these issues. We're trying to work on the sort of brackets and the breaking up of the occupation. We use this for our scheduling as well, trying to put the right people on the right kind of jobs that they can manage, and also use it for training to move people up kind of through the system and things like that. Fairly early stages at the moment, but this is not something that any one firm can do on its own. It's an industry-wide thing. It's not like if you secretly increase your wages on your own, you're going to suddenly hoover up a whole lot of people. You're going to go out of business if you do that. It needs everyone to do it at once. How you coordinate that is kind of still an open question.